This is lecture one for judicial process. All right. First off, any discussion at all dealing with judicial process requires that we understand something about human nature, because the process, anything we might consider judicial, will rest upon human nature. So if we don't understand human nature, we don't understand any rationale behind having a judicial process, or even why having government. So what it comes down to is looking at those things that drive us to want to create governments, and then the purpose behind creating them, and then the means by which that purpose gets satisfied or accomplished, or however. So if you imagine, in a very simple scenario, you've got one person on a desert island all by themselves. There are no issues. There's no confusion. There's no war. There's nothing. It's just that person making decisions for themselves and suffering the consequences or the benefit of the decisions they make. It's really simple, right? There's no real difficulty there. Now we introduce a second person to the island. And there are some difficulties, but they recognize pretty quickly that if they work in concert towards certain ends, that they're likely to be more successful. Hunting, gathering, whatever it may be. So they learn to cooperate. Now, the cooperation may not be total. They're going to certainly have difficulties. But for the most part, there are things that get worked out because there are two of them. Right? And eventually, as long as they benefit by having a relationship with the other, they'll continue that relationship. Whether it's for fundamental needs, food, that sort of thing, or protection, whatever it might be. Now let's introduce a third person to that island. Now we got a much more difficult dynamic, because now any two could join forces and benefit more from it than if all three worked in concert. So think about something very basic. They need to eat. There's some animal they can take down and nourish themselves. But you really only need two people to do that. So the third one, there's not much added value. So after a while, they start looking askance at each other and thinking, well, don't really need him or her to do this. And then we still have to share the food with them. So perhaps we're better off in this very simple world, excluding them somehow. I'm not saying kill them, but exclude them in some way that benefits them. Now think about making that just a little bit more complicated. Suppose that third person is not very good at hunting or gathering, so you don't really need them for that. But it turns out that there's another group of 3 or 4 people on the other side of the island that you've discovered, and they're hostile towards you. Now all of a sudden that third person, who doesn't have much added value in terms of sustaining oneself food-wise, is necessary to fight the battle, if the battle needs to be fought. Okay, so it gets incrementally more and more complicated. Now let's get to a world of 6, 7, 8 billion people, or a nation of 350 million, 450 million people, or even just a city with 1 million people. Those sorts of, and although things get more complicated than just hunting for food and protection, things get more complicated. But at each step, once we get past that one person, there is a decision tree, a process for deciding about what you should or should not do here. Do we keep them? Do we not keep them? So on and so forth. And that process, right, has a goal. The goal is what? Survival, sustainability, that sort of thing. Okay, so when we talk about a larger society, there's still the same problem. How do we value each member of that structure, of that society, whatever we want to call it for now? How do we evaluate that? How do we make a determination about whether or not that person is really is really represents added value or not? And what happens if the added value changes? In other words, the actual way in which we evaluate changes. Maybe we didn't care much for the really tall guy, but now we realize that a lot of the fruit that we need to survive is on high branches, and we can't reach them, the tree can't be climbed. All of a sudden, the tall guy matters. Before, not so much. So things change. So why is all of this really, really important? Because at its core, we're still answering the question about that third guy in the aisle. We're still trying to figure out how we bring things together, right, to form something that serves all of us under as many possible conditions as possible, right? On the island, the conditions are, need to eat, protect yourself from the elements, protect yourself from other animals, and probably even other groups. Well, it comes down to kind of the same thing. In a much more complex way. I don't want to oversimplify, but for purposes of just getting our minds around the thing we're looking at here, right? I mean, that's what it comes down to. All right, so we obviously form governments, and it seems to serve some sort of natural need, because no matter where you go around the world, and I do not know this is a fact, but I feel pretty confident it is. People form governments. I'm trying to think of a place where a group of people have come together and they're really not together, or they are together but they haven't formed any organization. Human beings like doing that, right? You get 5 people together, they say, hey, we all like, we all like playing baseball, we should do something with that. There's this need, not only to be social, because that's, I think, very much embedded in the nature of human beings. We're social animals. And so if for no other reason, then we just like the company of others, generally speaking. And so that being the case, we tend to think about how we can form organizations. In short, how we can organize ourselves. So when you look around the world, I mean, and you see all these governments, I mean, at last count, I think there are 181 countries. And presumably they all have governments. As you'll see later on, that these structures are important. But the idea is that that's what we do. And I guess what I'm asking is, why do we do that? And looking at the little island, we say to ourselves, well, we do that because, there's safety in numbers, if you will, right? And that makes perfect sense, right? We know that if we don't have the support of others, even in an advanced society, without the support of others, things get more difficult. So it would make sense that we would want to do that, is what I'm saying. Okay, so I want you to keep something in mind here. We need to lay a groundwork. We just can't jump into the judicial process. Well, I guess we could, and it would be nothing more than just, well, here's how the process works. But that's meaningless. To understand how something works, but not understand the very soul of it. In other words, understanding what makes a car run is all well and good. But it's more important to know what you can do with that car when it does run. Go to distant places, carry cargo to different places, be free to move from one place to another. So in order to really talk about the judicial process in a way that's going to be meaningful, there are certain things that have to be put in place and certain questions that we have to answer before we begin delving into it and then asking more specific questions about the process itself. So we need to know why the process, we need to know why the governments, we need to understand what we're trying to get out of this whole thing. Because depending upon what we want to get out of having this, these particular structures put in place is important for directing what they're supposed to do. In other words, I need to know why we're doing it, because that gives us purpose. And then we understand, okay, this is why we're doing it. Are we satisfying the purpose? If we're not satisfying the purpose, then we're doing it either incorrectly or poorly, or the thing we want to get out of it can't be gotten out of it. That is to say, we're seeking something we can't have. Think of, one of the millions of, internet sort of advertisements where, it turns out there's this one fruit, if you eat it before you go to bed, you'll lose 35 pounds in a week. Now, for most of us, I think we say, well, it doesn't make any sense, right? It just doesn't. 35 pounds. But I think I saw one not too long ago that said 28 pounds. And it wasn't like 28 pounds in 28 days. It was like 28 pounds. I don't know if you could lose 28 pounds by just not eating for a week. I don't think that's even, so if you're not eating for a week, you get my point. I'm not a nutritionist. But the idea here is that if you have a purpose in creating something, that purpose, right, requires a process in order to accomplish its ends. And so we have to ask, okay, what's the purpose? That's the first thing. What's the purpose? Right? If there's no discernible purpose to doing something, why create a process for it? Process helps you acquire, and meet the purpose. All right. So basically, we have to figure out, okay, what do we really want out of a structure? What's the point of it? We got the 3 guys. Now we got 4. We got 5. We got 20. We got 20 million. We got 6 billion. What's the point? And tangentially, does the point change? In other words, maybe structures we talk about and processes we talk about are really good for 4 people, but when you get to 40 million, they don't work. Or 4 billion, they don't work. And I would argue that's constantly the case. We have to readjust. We have to change. We have to alter because we can't foresee everything, and we don't really know what's going to happen when that 3rd person joins the island, right? We know it's probably not going to be good. And why is that? Because of human nature. Now, I'd like to be able to, get us all off the hook here by giving us some sort of, pass on being who we are. That after all, we live in an existence of uncertainty. It's reasonable to say, although I'm not certain it's true, it's reasonable to say that, human beings are probably, the only species that has a sense of their own mortality. I said mortality. We all kind of know that we're going to go, right? We like to believe that that's not possible, and all the talk of artificial intelligence coming along and replacing us, and I guess they'll go on forever. Although that seems far-fetched, but so does flying in airplanes. I'm sure the founders of the country, if we could bring them back from the grave, I don't think Madison or any of them would be saying, well, let's look at the political structures that you've put in place and let's see how they're working. I think they'd be looking up in the sky and saying, what the hell is that thing? Well, that's a plane. What do you mean it's a plane? Well, people get in, it flies, and they go someplace else. There are people in that. How does it get off the ground? Only Franklin might have been, oh, that makes sense. But I think they'd be too busy freaked out by all of us driving cars past them. I don't imagine that wouldn't be the case. So we really can't, in the long run, have things that we can't adapt, right? That's why we talk about the U.S. government and the process. You always have to adjust things. Everything needs an adjustment. Everything needs a tune-up because things change. And you have to be careful about those adjustments and when things change because, in fact, all kinds of other things could sort of come into the mix. So I think when we talk about knowing that we're mortal, that's the excuse. That's what gets us off the hook a bit, right? It's like, well, then, and there's a scarcity of resources. And so, we're running for our lives here. And we just want to be able to eat and survive and all of this other stuff. And then you say, okay, but you do eat and you do survive and you do have a house. Yeah, but you know what? I could lose the house. Well, that's true, but there are programs that, but still you got to catch up. But you own 4 houses. I know, but Mike, and Alice and this other friend of mine, Jim, they all own 12 houses. I mean, you understand? It's like, no, I don't understand. You can't live in 12 houses at one time. Yeah, but that's not the point. They have 12 houses. So it's interesting. We can make the scarcity argument. Well, there are scarce resources, and so that's why we fight over things, right? I'm going to make the argument that that's our nature, right? I think it's just greed. It's fundamental greed and fear. We live a lot off of fear in the physical realm. Not that I know of any other realm, but in the physical realm here, it appears that we're running scared all the time, right? Always worried about what to do next. So, you've got to really make sure you take care of things and that you see into the future and all this. I think that we're running scared, and that is a nice, neat excuse for, needing to organize things. But then this happens. Well, we want to organize it so we don't have to be so worried. But if I can organize it and structure it in a way that will benefit me more than others, then this is really a good structure for me because I'll do better. And as you see when we get to elites and the structuring of the government, how that all works. But you know that you know that process already. You witnessed it on various levels, and from grade school on up. So we understand how that works. Okay, and you see more and more of it in America, for example, with the consolidation of wealth with the very few, right? And that's fascinating on so many levels because of the way in which a lot of people perceive it. How they take to it, what they think about it. For all the arguments about scarcity and the like, people seem to be okay with it. They can't sort of look up to those people that manage to collect the greatest amount of resources, especially, obviously, wealth. All right, so fundamentally, we have to believe that human beings can work collaboratively. 2, we have to believe that they're rational. They are rational, and they come together because they have a rational end or purpose they wish to satisfy. And I think it's reasonable to assume that that purpose, first and foremost, would probably be survival. That's really hard to define because survival, well, for one person, it's one house or owning their own home. For others, it's like 8 homes. I mean, I'm really getting by. I mean, I've heard, I'm sure you all have too, children that have, they're 10 years old and they have, computers and their own televisions and you name it, they've got it. And yet they feel somehow something's missing, right? That they want something more. I think in some ways, maybe the excuse is the uncertainty of things. We're so uncertain about everything. It's like if I had a little bit more, maybe that would make me feel better. I don't know. I don't want to get too analytical, but, put everybody on the couch here, but maybe that's what it is. I don't know, and I really don't care for our purposes. For our purposes, what I want us to all accept is we form governments. And that there's a purpose why we do that. Right? Even in the mind of someone who is, mentally unstable, regardless of the horrific thing they may do, they still have a rationale and can justify it in their own mind. It makes no sense to other people of sound mind, but in their view of the world, the way their brain is functioning, the way they perceive things, it makes perfect sense, right? That's why it's so difficult to really, we talk about all these school shootings and the like, and while it's incredibly unsettling to all of us, and we all want an answer to it, the one thing that's difficult to look at is mental illness. Because first of all, how do you define that? 2, how do you find out if someone has it? And 3, if you could find out if someone had it, would someone corrupt that process so people that weren't, mentally challenged in some way, in terms of reality, could be put away because someone said they were. So rather than that, we can talk about other issues that make us feel good, but ultimately, someone who is not of sound, mind is not rational, right? And therefore, you can't reason with that person. There comes a point at which all this gets very sort of loose and very sort of amorphous unless you start saying, well, here's the purpose. The purpose shall guide you. What do we really want from government? What do we really want from our lives? For some people, they want a job where they can go work, where they're going to be secure, they can come home, they can have a grilled cheese sandwich, and they can watch the game on Sunday or Saturday. That's what they want. That's what makes them happy. And that's great. That's wonderful. But that's what does it for them. Others, they want to own the team that's playing on Saturday. And then there are others that want to own that team, and they want to own 2 of the companies that are advertising on that station watching the game on Saturday. And it's fine if each one of them wants what they want, they can acquire it, and it doesn't necessarily take from others. And we'll get to all of that. But the fundamental point here is a pretty straightforward one. We form governments. We do that. We group together. And so we obviously come together for some reason. And we'll talk about this, but fundamentally, I mean, it's helpful if you speak the same language so you can communicate. It's helpful if you share some common experiences. When you think about it, when you meet someone for the first time, say on a college campus, you're probably drawn to someone that looks like you, right? Physically, in some way, by one or more characteristics. Typically, if you're a person with 5 different hair colors in your head, and you see someone else on campus with also a lot of different dye colors in their hair, you're probably going to be drawn to talking to that person. Why? Commonality, common ground. Oh, I do all these different colors in my hair, and love purple. I don't know, but they're drawn to it. Religion does that. Sports will do that. The college you graduate from, you may be somewhere at some point in some place in the world, and you'll come across someone. You could be 60, and you come across someone, and you have a conversation with them, and it turns out they went to Queens College. You went to Queens. I went to Queens College. What year did you graduate? Oh, wow. What was your major? It was psychology, but I minored in political science. I majored in political science. Hey, did you take Bonomo? Yeah, I did. Wasn't that a horrible experience? Can you believe that guy is still teaching there? Right? But you have commonality. And that's the thing, right? It's interesting that when you talk about meritocracies, and I believe there are only a few, if you can call them that. One is sports. Look, you can put the ball in the basket, you can throw the ball, you can catch the ball, you can hit the ball, you can kick the ball, or you can't. As much as I want to be, the next LeBron James, it's not going to happen, right? I mean, unless like everybody on the planet can no longer play basketball, then I'm your guy. But you get the point, right? It's a meritocracy. You can do it or you can't do it. I also believe comedy is a meritocracy because you're funny or you're not funny. You can be funny to a few, just like you can be a talented basketball player to a few. But fundamentally, we always know when someone better comes along, right? And we were always trying to measure that, right? Think about, GOAT, right? Greatest of all time. In basketball, it's a big thing. They keep talking about Michael Jordan. They talk about this one and that one. Now, is it LeBron James? Was it Kobe? The point is, and I apologize for all you folks that are not into basketball, but the point is this. You're taking a lot of the elements out of that. It's the best basketball player for their time because things change. The rules now have changed in basketball. You can't compare, how many points would, I'm going into this too deep, I can tell already, but I'm enjoying it. So how many points would Michael Jordan have really scored playing under today's rules? It'd be more. So you can't measure based on the yardstick of how many points someone scores and so on. All right, I promise I'll stay off the sports analogies. But we're always concerned with how we evaluate things, right? So the judicial process is really important because, as you'll see as we move down through these lectures, that we really, really depend upon it. In fact, I would argue it's the last structure between us and chaos. Because political structures cause chaos. And so, if this is not a great comparison, but I'll make it anyway. The judicial process is sort of the refs, umpires, right, of the political and governmental sort of structures. And if you eradicate that, then you're missing a wheel, and nothing really works correctly, as you'll see. All right, so we start from that place that we really need to gather. We're social animals, and we are smart enough to know that we're better off working together than apart. And why we work together, what we hope to get from that, I can't say. I gave it an out, right? Oh, because life is short, it's brutal, there's scarce resources. I believe if there were no such thing as scarce resources, if all you had to do is imagine what you wanted and there it was, I still think that people would be driven to feel like they have less and they need more. And I think that's part and parcel of the physical realm, not getting too esoteric. All right, so the first stop along the way, which is really important, is defining some terms. Okay? Now, why is this important? If we don't know what we're talking about, then how can we talk about it intelligently? In other words, we have to agree on how we define things, right? So if someone says, "Oh, I really love that person," well, you got to define love. It's not defined in one way. What I was really saying was they're just really nice. Well, what does nice mean? So before you all jump on it and say, "Wait a minute here, it seems like you're parsing words." No. In the legal realm, say for lawyers, words are their stock in trade. That's all the law is. When the Supreme Court writes decisions, words to explain things, right? So we have to be very careful about how we define things. And we have to make sure we understand the definition, because if we're talking about that particular thing, we have to make sure that we're talking about the same thing. And because that thing has its own nature. Look, a horse is not a donkey, right? A donkey, a farmer will keep a donkey because a donkey will keep the coyotes away. It'll kill a coyote or a wolf, but a horse won't, but a donkey will. I'm sorry, a mule. A mule will, right? So sorry if I offended all of you zoologists out there. I think that's what you'd be, right? A zoologist. Anyway, the point is this. We have to define some terms. And you should know the definition of these terms. So let's take a second there and pause. What does that mean? It means I'm going to ask you them, right? It means I'm going to want to know that you know them. And the best way to know if you know them is to have them show up on an exam. So get your pens and pencils out and follow along. All right, there's no particular order to this. It's just as they pop into my head. So here we go. The first thing obviously is process, right? So a process is a manner of proceeding, right, or happening, right, in such a way that something goes on, a particular path or journey, right, or there's an order of these events. So simply put, a manner of proceeding or happening, things could happen in a way which something goes on, or course or order of events. In other words, a process and ordering of things, right, as they naturally proceed. This is how this goes. Think of it that way. This is how it goes, right? And everything that human beings think up have a process. Everything. I was going to go back to sports, but I won't. I'll do something else. Let's go to the arts. Okay? In the arts, if you're watching, a play, let's say music. We'll do music. With music, there are processes, right? The music moves from one note to the next, all the way to the end. And there's a relationship between all of those notes, right? And so for all those musicians out there, what we expect is that those things move in a certain pattern. Otherwise, you have chaos, right? In other words, if you have a symphony orchestra, but everyone just decides to play what they want to play, who would listen to that? We want it organized so we can really take that in. We can understand the music, right? We can hear it, we can assess it, we recognize it later on. Oh, that's this piece, or that's that song, right? And there are certain elements of that. They move in a certain way. There's rhythm, there's melody, counterpoint, all that stuff, and they move. So there's a process to the way in which music works. Now, we're not talking about the structure yet, just the process, right? If it's a play, same thing. The acts, the way in which a scene takes place, it's scenes building into acts, building into, right? All the way to the end. So that's the point here, is that process is just the way in which things move towards some end. So in the case of a play, it's that last scene. That's what the whole thing was about. The whole thing was about really getting to the last scene. To the last scene. Musically, the whole thing was to get to that last leading note that leads you to say, I feel it. Here comes the end, right? For those musicians out there, that leading tone, right? If you play it, you can't, anyone listening knows what they should hear next. They want to hear it. So if it's in the key of C, you hit B. Anyone's not familiar with music, go to a keyboard, find B, hit all the other notes leading up to C, and then don't hit that B and just hit the C, and you'll say, oh, that sounds okay. Hit the B and you go, I got to hit the C now. I've got to hit the C. The leading tone leads you. I want to go back to the home tone. I want to go back to C. Process the same way. We reason our way through. We get to the end and we say, okay, now we can make a decision about that. And our material, just words and reason. Look, whether you think human beings have gotten very far or not, one thing you have to say is that we've gotten pretty far just by answering several questions, right? Who, what, when, where, why, and how. That's all we've got. We've got nothing else. How'd that happen? Why'd that happen? What exactly happened, right? What caused it? So think about that. We have satellites flying around up there because we were able to answer those questions. Well, how do we do that? Why would that work? Why would that not work? So we ask questions, and think about the law. It's all questions, right? Taking evidence, trying to find out what the particulars are. So process is really important. You corrupt the process, right? It makes any real outcome almost, I won't say impossible, it makes the outcome very uncertain, right? So process is really important. And of course, as I said before, the word process implies what? It's an action or sequence of events or things, right, that are undertaken, right, for the purpose of effecting some goal. That's what they are, or producing some outcome. A process is there to get you from point A to point B, right? You want to go from Queens College to Manhattan. There's any number of subways that are part of the subway system. It's a system, and the process there takes you to various stops so you can go to different parts of Manhattan or the Bronx or Queens or Brooklyn or Staten Island. So process implies that there's a reason for doing something, and that means there's a goal somewhere, and that goal presumably has some purpose that is important. Okay? All right, here come a couple big ones. Moral. People throw us around all the time. Oh, that's not moral, or that's immoral, or that is moral. Well, all morality is it conforms to standards of what is right or just in behavior, right? So what do you mean what's right? There's that what word. Well, you tell me what's right. We're not going to agree on what's right. So you see someone and they are in the water. You're walking over this old past, they're in the water and they're screaming for help. They're drowning. And you don't help them. Now, do you have a moral obligation to help them? This is not going to turn into a philosophy class, no matter how much I enjoy that. But all right, so you don't do anything. Is that immoral? Well, morality there is a tough question because what's right and what's wrong? Is it right that you should give your life to save the life of another? Is that right? Do we think that's good? And if we don't think it's good, why is it not good? Okay, these are the philosophical questions that are beyond my pay grade, but you get the point here. So moral means nothing more than we kind of all agree is right or just. Yeah, that's good. That's the moral thing to do. Which means what? That most of us would think that that's the correct thing to do. So in the law, though, that person that was drowning, if I looked at them and then I did nothing, that's a problem for me in the law. If I looked at them and did nothing, but I couldn't swim, less of a problem. No one expects me to jump in the water and save someone from drowning when I can't swim myself, because all that's going to happen is two people are going to drown, right? What if you could have done something and you were staring at the person and they were yelling for help and you just kept staring at them? Was it moral just to stare at them? Well, there are alternative things you could have done. How about getting your cell phone and calling, dialing 911? How about looking for some branch to stick in the water, something to sort of help them so they don't drown? Right? So moral means nothing more than what we all think. It conforms to a standard of what we think is right behavior. So when someone says that's immoral, I'm always curious. So why is that immoral? What is it about it that's and so therefore, if you take the definition, morality changes. It could change based upon what we think is right. So, for example, there was a time, right, where the only coupling between people, getting married, was it was a man and a woman. Okay. And then fast forward, and we say, well, anything else is not moral. Moving forward, we say, well, no, wait a minute. No, people love each other. They should be allowed to get married, because all that really is the government saying, here's a license. We just want to know who to tax. Right? So, but then, say, okay, well, gays can marry. Now, is that immoral? Based on the idea that people decide what's moral or not moral, right? That this feels right. Now, you can make all the arguments you want, but the thing is, morality depends upon the group saying, yeah, that's good, that's right. Now, it doesn't mean they all think that. Sometimes the people with the loudest voices are the ones that maybe should have the mic a little bit less. They're not necessarily at the forefront of things. So, where does morality come from? Well, it comes from us. Now, what about ethics? You hear a lot about ethics. All ethics really means is that whatever's going on is in accordance, it's consistent with principles of right and wrong. So really, at its core, ethics are nothing more than really what actions are consistent with the morality. So that's it. So all of that, there is no hard and fast rule about, and I challenge anyone to tell me, well, this is something that is universally moral, and it's right no matter what. It's right no matter what. And I'll bet you there's people out there that mount an argument saying, no, it's not. We have lots of those things going on all the time, right? Where there's very heated discussions and disagreements about what we think is moral or is acceptable or is okay. We have several of those going on right now. For example, the pro-life and pro-choice camps, and people that think that abortion is a woman's right, it's her body, and so on and so forth, and people that disagree with that. But that's an argument, and it's not one that's settled by any means. Okay, and again, just so as you know, I'm not interested in having you think the way I think. I think that way. That's bad enough. So the idea here is that you learn, and you learn to integrate things and think, because that's what you bring to the table. Your ability to see things and put your 2 cents in. And that means you have to have an acuity and a skill set that allows you to do that. There is your value. Your value is to bring something in, right? The genius is really that person, while everyone is looking at this, the genius comes along and goes, no, that. And it goes, that, right? That's the point here. So we're constantly adjusting our morality. Because we're constantly changing what we think is right. Now, what's the standard for something being right? We'll get to that. Okay? Because underpinning the morality and therefore the ethical behavior, the morality is got to be something, some yardstick for determining what's right. Okay? We're going to get to that in a little bit. What's right. All right, what about justice? Justice is nothing more than the principle of moral rightness and decency. Now, decency throws a sort of, a monkey wrench into things. But what's decent, what's not decent. But the key here is something very simple, right? It's a principle of moral rightness. That's justice. Justice is really hard to define. And one of the things that you have to be really careful with here is a lot of people use the word fair for justice. Okay, look, the law is not really concerned with fair in terms of it being a primary purpose or goal, in part because fairness is very hard, very difficult to determine. For example, if you think about it this way, is fairness, take student loans. There was talk that there's going to be student loan forgiveness, and so all people that had student loans, they're going to wipe them out or take a big chunk out of it or whatever. And everyone applauded that and said that's great. And then up came all these folks who had paid off their student loans already. And their thing was, well, am I going to be reimbursed? Especially parents who said, I paid my kids $50,000 in college loans off. And now you're going to give everyone that owes money a free pass. Where's my 50 grand? I could have done something with that. The question then becomes, is it right? Is it right? Or is it just fair? Is it right to give him his money? Is it right only to give them the money that recently graduated? What's the right thing to do here? Well, what's the goal? If the goal is to get the debt off the back of the next generation of people that are graduating college and going out there and trying to make their way in the world, and that's going to be good for all of us, the economy and all that, then that's the right thing to do. Repaying the parents that paid off their kids' loan, well, their kids are already out there, and as parents, they made that decision. That was their obligation. They felt they did it. And they're good parents for doing it. Pat on the back, we love you, go home. Right? Okay, so what about the United States? Is it fair? Is it fair that the United States was a country that was surrounded by two major bodies of water on either side, and a lesser so in the south, a friendly and weaker nation to the north as our only neighbor, a land that is, to this day, I believe, the richest in natural resources in terms of pretty much everything. In terms of energy, I think the United States is still the leader in natural gas and coal, and as well as fossil fuel. I believe that's still the case. You might want to check that. But the United States has been given this favored position. Is that fair? Should the United States have to say, well, look, we have a lot of resources, a lot of great farming land, and we know that X country doesn't, so we're going to give them some of our farmland because we want everyone to have a fair shot at good farming. Now, we could do that if we felt that was the right thing to do. And then, of course, it was plausible. I mean, it's not very plausible to, well, I guess it is. You kind of figure out some weird scheme to kind of do that, but you get the point. Or how about, we have a lot of oil here. It's really not fair. Your country has no oil under its soil, so we're going to give you a bunch so that's fair. Is that fair? I mean, the people that live here don't have a right to it just because they happen to be on top of land with a lot of oil under it. There's nothing about that says, well, it's yours directly. It doesn't mean that it's not yours as a nation and as a people because, hey, this is where we live. Put that aside just for a second. If we're playing, landmass roulette here, we just spin the wheel and see who lands on what land and say, well, that's just your luck, your lot in life. I mean, look at the former, Soviet Union. Their argument was they were always taking over countries more or less because they were trying to get to warm water ports. Nations that are landlocked don't have access to getting stuff out. The United States could have shipping from all over the place. The eastern seaboard, down south, the west coast. The United States is in a very enviable position. Even our temperatures in this country are, from way up north to way south, are still reasonably moderate, right? And so that means you have some farmland at different zones. You can grow different things. We're not stuck right on the equator or really far away. We're not Iceland, which is beautiful, by the way. It's Greenland. It's not so hot. Anyway, all right. So fair is a word we don't use here. It gets used a lot especially by children, that's not fair. Well, fair is not definable. And it's not a very solid foundation upon which to build a justice system. Now, I'm not saying that fair doesn't come into play, that you can't look at something and go, you know what, there's something fundamentally unfair about this, and it needs to be changed. That happens. But you can't build a system that solely rests upon the concept of fair, because it's very hard to codify fair. So we all understand, oh, that's fair, that's not fair. Why? Because fair is really circumstantial. It's not. It's driven by circumstance. It's not driven by anything else. We have, I think, a great propensity as human beings. Especially I think in certain cultures, which we'll get into, certain cultures to think in terms of we can control our destiny. And I always like when I hear it because it's very uplifting. It's wonderful to think that. But when you really think about it, you have very little you can control, right? Look, you're born to two people that pass along a gene pool. There's stuff in your gene pool. There's good stuff. There's bad stuff. There's stuff. You have no control over that stuff. And here's the thing. Not all the stuff in the gene pool comes to you. So you don't know what stuff that's in the gene pool that if we could pull it off the shelf, decide we wanted, we might not have wanted, but there it is. And then it gets more complicated because it turns out that your genes aren't necessarily your destiny. That there are things you could do in your life that actually will activate or deactivate certain genes. Provided that, I guess, you have those genes and you want to deactivate them or activate them, and then you can find out how to do that and then go about doing it. Did that confuse everybody? Okay. So the point there is, right from the get-go, before you even come into the world, certain decisions have already been made for you. Then another decision will be made, obviously. You have no control over who mom and dad are. We don't get to choose. We don't get to say, you know what, that guy's my father. Yeah, okay, no, I'm exercising my right. I'm trading that guy in. I want that guy, right? So you're stuck with your parents. Then you're stuck in the moment in time in which you're born. If you're born in 1750, and you're a female, it's very different than being born, in 1950. Very different being born in 2020, and I'm sure it'll be very different than being born in 2080. You have no control over that. You have no control over where you're born, what country, what region, what kind of weather you're going to have, any of that, right? You have no control over which school you'll go to, if you even get to go to school, or what teachers you're going to have for the most part, right? Maybe when all is said and done, the only really important choice you have is to exercise your will or not, to say, I want that or I don't want that, right? There's so much that opens the door. I mean, I'm back to basketball again. You have all these basketball players that, you have to have a skill level for any sport, right? That's why we go watch them, because they're not the norm. You wouldn't want to pay to watch me play basketball, but I don't think you'd want to pay for LeBron James to teach about, or maybe you would, it'd be more fun, for him to teach about the judicial process. He'd probably tell you to speak to his lawyers. But the point is this, that when we talk about things we have that can work for us, it's up to us to utilize those, right? Whatever it is, if it's only 2% of the whole shebang that we really have control over through exercising, we can at least exercise that. More times than not, we take a good look around our environment and our circumstances, and we make decisions based on that, right? We say, wait a minute, my father was a lawyer, his father was a lawyer, and I kind of like the law, I've been around it, I think I'll be a lawyer. That person that's the first lawyer in the family, it's sort of like, not that being a lawyer is anything special, I'm going to make it sound as if that's what everyone would want to be. Neurosurgeon. It's just that some genes were there, this, that, other thing, and you felt a pull towards it, it felt normal, whatever, and next thing you know, there you are, open up someone's head, and doing your magic. All right, so I don't really want to hear the word fair because it's all unfair. And then it doesn't get us anywhere to say that's not fair. We need a structure and a process to dealing with the lack of fairness, all right? Because that unfairness is not good. We want fairness because fairness means consistency. But we can't define fairness, therefore it can't be consistent, therefore it's not a good standard upon which to build a structure. Okay, so no good. Okay? All right, so then let's talk about, utilitarianism, but I think I'm going to save that for later. I don't want to pop it in here. I want to pop it in before I do Rawls' theory of justice here. Okay, let's talk about equality then, because that's equality is an important thing here, right? So what is equality? It's just the state of being neither superior nor inferior, greater or less, better nor worse, stronger nor weaker, etc., with regard to the thing or things compared. So they're equal in intelligence, they're equal in size, they are equal in opportunity, which is something we're really concerned with. We are equal under the eyes of God. We are equal within the court system, right? Justice is blind for a reason, right? Justice is blind, so they can't see who you are, what you got, or any of that. You're just somebody there with a litany of issues or whatever, and that's it. So equality just means that they're the state of being, right? So keep in mind is that equality is really important for our purposes because what we want is equal treatment under the law. And you're going to see why that's really important and why the process can affect whether it's that or not equal under the law, and especially the political structure, and why the judicial process and structure is so important as a means of leveraging against a political structure that serves those that make the decisions and also is subject to the winds of political change. We need something that's consistent. Consistency is important. Look, if you had a really horrible dad, but your dad was consistently horrible, you adjust to that, right? You can, within reason, right? You can adjust to that and say, yeah, my father, horrible human being. But he was consistently horrible. So we always know what to expect, right? The danger is the inconsistency. Oh, my father, he's a really loving man that always do horrible things. Who wants to live with that guy, right? We all want the dad that's just, oh, what a great dad. I was so lucky to have that person as a dad. Or at least, my dad was a good man. He did his best. You at least want that, So when we talk about equality, it's a very important thing because it's a measurement, especially in what we're going to be doing, that the system is consistent. Because you don't put together a structure that's inconsistent. I'll say it again. You don't put together a structure that's inconsistent because that is of no value, right? You don't put a grading system in place, but it's inconsistent. Well, and you know this, right? Oh, take that profession. It gives everybody A's. Not that that would ever happen in Queens, but I hear it happens in other places. And so what occurs? People take that person. Or no, really hard grader. Your 4.0, kiss that goodbye. Because that B you're going to get, no matter what, it's going to bring down that GPA. And so you make a decision, I'm not going to take that class. I'm not saying there aren't students that would say, you know what, my GPA is really important, but I think I'm going to learn a lot here. That's what people say. You're not going to get an A, but you're going to learn an awful lot, and I really want to learn. That's every professor's sort of delusional think structure before you go into class for the first time. This is the way it is. But of course, it doesn't make sense for it to be that way. Practical, right? Practical. Hours put in, grade coming out. There's a lot of talk today about equity, for example, too. Equality and equity. And I think people are confused by those two things. I can understand it because they're sort of intertwined in certain ways. But equity is a state of quality of being just and fair. It's a fair thing to do, and it's also just. Okay, the word just, right? So justice then is achieved not simply according to some sort of strict letter of the law, but in accordance with principles or ideas of what substantial justice and the unique facts of the case would demand. All right, so we talk about equity today. We say, okay, look, fundamentally here, is it fair that this group has not received more X? So to make it fair, they should receive more X. Of course, those that receive less say that's not fair. So the equity argument is one that by its structure requires a comparison, right? That when you make it, almost guarantees that someone's going to lose so somebody could win, sort of thing, right? That there's a gain to be made. So in terms of justice, it's not just according to some sort of strict letter of the law, but equity goes one step further. It says, well, what about? It's also about fairness, and fairness again is not. It's really important, but it's not something you can build an entire structure on because we can't really define it. Right? We really can't define it. What's fair? I don't know. Is it fair to pay off the student loans of people that just recently graduated in the last few years, but not pay off the student loans of people that graduated before that, going back 50 years? Is that fair? Would it be fair to pay off that person's loans from 50 years ago or 20 years ago, and they've got a job making $10 million a year? Should you pay off theirs? Is it fair that people that are already multimillionaires should be allowed to win the lottery and keep the money, or should they throw the money back into the coffers and have it sort of dispensed amongst other people? Is it fair that the United States has all this oil under its soil? It often comes down to whose ox is being gored. In other words, who's being hurt, right? I think it's fair until it hurts me, then it's not fair anymore. That's what's so strange about fair. Fair can't be consistent, and so what we want is consistency. And that's key, because that's what equality will give us, consistency. Equity is difficult. Equality doesn't have a sense of fairness to it. It has to be by the very nature of its structure, because equality means consistency. Fairness does not mean consistency, right? In fact, I would argue that in order for something to be fair, oftentimes you have to introduce an inconsistency, right? Like the student loans, right? And then you have to make a decision based on that. And then maybe if you make more decisions like that, you can say, well, that's the right thing to do. In these circumstances, sort of precedent, right? In these circumstances, this is the right outcome. Okay, also capitalism. I think people confuse capitalism, socialism, communism, and all that. I understand why. But for our purposes, and accurately so, what we want to see is that capitalism is an economic system, right? It's an economic system. And within an economic system, the production and the distribution, right, the means of doing those two things are privately or corporately held, owned, developed, and so on and so forth, right, through the accumulation of wealth and profits being reinvested. So capitalism is basically an economic system where individuals, groups, corporations, whatever, own the means of production and distribution, right? Socialism, there's any number of theories around socialism. I think it's one of the things that makes things so confusing for people. It's called socialism because it's a system of social organization, not market organization, which would be just economics, right? In which the means of producing and distributing goods in that structure, right, is owned collectively. That's the idea. Or by centralized government that often plans and controls the economy. All right, so fundamental difference. In a capitalist structure, the market is determining things. What products should be brought to market, what the price should be in the market, supply and demand, all of that. It's a free-for-all. In a capitalist structure, it's supposed to be. You'll see that going back to the idea of setting up rules and processes, how that can be corrupted. But in fundamental capitalism, it's the market decides, right? The invisible hand, as Adam Smith would say. That No one can move that hand to determine the supply of a good or the price you can get for it or the demand. You just say, hey, you want to buy stuff, you want to sell stuff, come into the fairgrounds here, and put up your stand and just try and sell. So you got two guys selling apples, and one guy selling apples for $1, and the other guy selling an apple for 75 cents. And so they notice, the $1 apple people notice that the 75-cent apple people are doing a lot of business. And so they lower their price down to 75 cents too. And they recognize, they look at it and say, you know what though, it's not necessarily we're getting more business than them now. We're getting more business, but we're not getting still as much. And they say, well, what are we going to do? We can't move our stand. We can't shine up our apples anymore so they look better. We'll drop the price. We'll drop it down to 70 cents. And sure enough, people come over, they start buying more of their apples. There's a whole economic thing going on here. What kind of a good it is and all kinds of stuff, which is really fascinating. But we're going to keep it simple as apple pie. Sorry. So you've got, they lower it and people come over. These guys say, we're not going to lose market to them. We're going to lower our price. And what happened was, eventually go back and forth, and they both realized we can't lower it anymore. We're going to start losing money. So I can't afford to lower the price anymore. And then other things kick in, the quality and so on and so forth. There's a great story about this very mechanism going way back when in the history of New York. There used to be, like on the Bowery, there would be all these shops down there. And there were these two stores that sold a whole bunch of things right next to each other. This building, it had I guess apartments above it and all that, right? And these guys would compete constantly. And people always went to these two stores. They knew, I don't like that price there. They got a better price next door, I bet. Yeah, they do. But these guys there, I'll go back. That guy has a better price. And for the longest time, everyone flocked because they knew these two guys hated each other and they would just compete. Until they found out they were brothers. They lived right above it. They owned the building. And they would just plan out. I'll lower the apples today. You raise them. All right, good. What about the bananas? Okay, what about the tissues? Well, you know what? Let's keep that price the same. So people don't go back and forth constantly. But let's work this. This is where we get our biggest margin. So they both own both. But people thought the open market was at work there because these guys were competing. Turns out it wasn't, right? So in a capitalist market, we expect the market just to operate like that. We'll see. It doesn't because, again, people want to control the process because the process gives them, a greater return. So, and human beings being who they are. So this idea of a centralized government planning and controlling an economy, here's the thing about the invisible hand. You may not be able to control it, although they do. They try and control that completely because it means more money for them. But it moves. It's hard. So you kind of have to just follow it. What do people want? What are they doing? It's a good thing. It makes you want to produce goods that people want, makes you give them a price that they're willing to pay for it, so on and so forth. When you say the government, okay, you should never use the word government and efficiency ever in the same sentence. It's a beast that is made of pulled together parts that don't necessarily work very well, and then we entrust people to make decisions that they're really not necessarily all that astute at making, right? So the idea here is that when we trust government to do those things, it's a little disconcerting because the sense of it is, well, wait a minute, the government, they're not, these guys, they really know what they're doing. My argument is they really don't. If they did, we'd be in better shape all around the world. But we're still trying to get our act together. All right, what about communism? Now, a communism is also a government system in which the state plans and controls the economy. And typically, the government is one party. So it's even more narrower, right, than socialism. It's maybe, this is so incorrect, but I'm going to say it anyway. It's sort of socialism on steroids. It's like not only are we controlling everything, but it's just us, our party. There is no other party. Socialism, you get, although even in democracy, I would argue that, is there really that much difference between Democrats and Republicans? Have we figured that one out yet? Okay. So with communism, you know, you get people who have communism not really sure what it is, but basically it's the same thing as socialism, only as one party that is completely shallow as it can be as a political scientist. But I just need you to grab that. Just grab that. So what about democracy? Well, democracy is, whether it's representative democracy or not, it's a political, right, or social unit, no economics involved here, right? And the common people are considered basically the primary source of political power. Sounds pretty good. Unless your view of the common folk is that they're ignorant, they should be just pushed aside, and that they're a grand waste of your time. Let's get things done out of the way. I think Justin Trudeau said, this is like floating around on that one brain cell I have, so sort of banging back and forth, but I think it was Justin Trudeau said that he admired the Chinese system because they could do what they needed to do for their people without sort of interference. If that's what he said, and if I remember correctly, that's so wrong on so many levels that it's hard to get one's mind around, because it says you can't trust the average person, because I believe in the collective consciousness of people. That is that I don't think everyone in America is a Rhodes Scholar. I don't think every Rhodes Scholar is a Rhodes Scholar. I don't really think that anyone has all the answers, right? But I think collectively, if there are enough of us throwing in our stuff, eventually it comes out pretty good, because it has to. Why? All these other forces are at work. You take a box, you take a box, and you get enough people spinning it. Eventually, you round off the edges, and although it may not be a box anymore, it's something that's in some ways better. You know, you're not responsible for knowing that on an exam, the box thing. All right, so the common folk, what does the average person want? The nice thing about democracy and voting, right, is that you pull the lever and it's only you, but you see it's like little drops. If you've ever noticed, the worst snowfalls are not the big flakes, it's those little flakes. You think, it's just snowing a little bit, but they just pile up. The big flakes are almost at the end of it, right? So that's sort of what a democracy sort of is. Now, just quickly, as an aside, which I'll get back to, when you think about democracy and you think about capitalism, they're sort of strange bedfellows. Because capitalism says the individual owns all this stuff that could make money. And there's no limit on what they could do, even if they're taking money from others. And those others can't make as much money because they're taking it. Because democracy says, well, the people have to consider it. And the people give you the political power. And so politicians say one thing to the people, get elected, then do what their corporate sponsors want them to do. And is that just or not? Is it fair? I don't know. Fairness is not something we use, right? And we go case by case. Okay, what about a republic? Here, again, it's a political order, and supreme power lies where? In a body of citizens who are entitled to vote for officers and representatives responsible to them. So what we have here is we have a democratic republic. We have the people have the power, they're giving it to you, and we do that through the form of electing people to go out there and do the job for us. So it's really, it's a democracy, because that's where the power resides, but it's a republic, a democratic republic, because we have people that we then vote for to go ahead and do our bidding for us, which they do poorly on both sides of the aisle, and have always done poorly. Not completely horribly, but they've not done well. For a whole host of reasons, which are beyond the scope of the course, so I won't talk about it. All right. One other thing I want to introduce you to here is the idea of externalities. Externalities are nothing more than, and they can be positive externalities, although typically we talk about negative externalities. They're basically a cost or benefit, so negative or positive, right, that affects people other than those involved in the economic activity that produced it, and that is not reflected in prices. That sounds really complicated, but I'll give you an example of it. Cigarette smoking. Okay. The industry, right, is there any things outside of buying the cigarettes and smoking them that is problematic? Does it raise a cost for someone. Well, think about it this way: if we believe that you cigarette smoke, will give you lung cancer, let's say, and then people that can't afford the medical coverage to have the lung cancer dealt with, the public has to pay for, and so that's sort of a negative externality. But other things are as well. Imagine living downstream from a big chemical plant where they're dumping chemicals they're not supposed to be dumping into the water, but that's cheaper for them so they make more money. But meanwhile, it has a negative impact on others. People that are not involved in the making of or the buying of or the profit of something, but are suffering a consequence of that process. That could be, if it's a suffering, that's a negative externality. And you're going to see that that's an issue that we have to kind of grapple with all the time. All right. So those are the things that I want you to be able to have at the ready when we talk about defining things. I think the thing you have to really focus on is this idea of utility, utilitarianism, justice, democracy. One of the things I did not mention was monopoly, but we're going to get into that. And I define it as we get into it, so we should be okay with that. All right, so we come now back after all this sort of descriptive language, defining things. And there are going to be more things we have to define, and everything I define, you got to know is going to show up later. That's one of the important things here, right? Learning to use the correct language to talk about something. All right, so one of the fundamental questions then was, right? Okay, great. So tell me, how do we go about figuring out what's just, what's moral, what's ethical, what the process is supposed to be like? We know we're going to form governments. We kind of accept that about us. I think we have to just accept that. Right? We're going to form governments. We do that all the time. We've done it as long as it's been recorded history. We've come together in groups. We've formed nations. We formed, so that's what we do. That's our gig. We come and we create, we make stuff. Oh, come on, there's 4 of us. Let's put a bowling team together. I mean, it's just the way it is, right? Political Science Association. All of a sudden we all have so much to say to each other. Not all of a sudden. But anyway, so is there a way in which we can get at what goal, whatever process we come up with, is supposed to get us to? In other words, what's the goal, right? If it's to make everybody happy, then we have to find a process that will lead to everybody being happy, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I mean, okay, Jefferson's great and all that stuff. I think he was terribly overrated, but nevertheless, if you're gonna steal from John Locke, life, liberty, and property. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I've got college students that plagiarize better than that. But anyway, so what's the goal? The government serves a purpose, and there's a process. Because if there's a purpose, there's got to be a process to satisfy that purpose and reach the goal. Okay, so if there's a purpose, there's a process. And the process, right, helps us accomplish the purpose, which is the goal. Right? All right, so how do we get to what it is the goal should be? That's the first question. We can't talk about a judicial process. We could. I could tell you the lay of the land, and we could talk about all kinds of theories, which we will do, and we can talk about situations today that exist so we can analyze them, which we will do. The cases and so on, we'll do that. All right. So here's what I think. I think a very solid way of approaching this is to figure out what we all want. Because if we all want the same thing, we all would like, really ripe bananas to be a nickel. That's our goal in life. That's all we want. Everyone says, well, I just got 12 new cars. Yeah, but I just got a banana for 5 cents. It's like, oh, God, I got a banana for 5 cents? If that's the goal, that's the goal. I don't care if it's fair, right, just. If that's what you all think, then that's fine. Let's get some bananas. All right. So this guy named Rawls had an economic theory of justice. I'll tell you what he basically, explores or want to explore next time. I just want to introduce you the idea that that's where we're going. And also, another question, because this will answer that question of what the goal should be. And then we're going to talk about next time the tragedy of the commons, which is nothing more than an exploration of what can go wrong, given human nature and given a process, right, to get to some sort of, complete some sort of purpose. So it'll be those two things next time that we'll focus on. Rawls' economic theory of justice and also the tragedy of the commons. And then after that, we're going to talk about the rule of law. Well, there's other stuff too, but fundamentally, I'm going to take the first few lectures just to lay the groundwork. Okay, so next time we'll pick up on Rawls.